Hello wrestling fans. Welcome back to the $20 million Pro Wrestlemania studio and welcome back to the show. We are into the events of 1998, including Austin and Mike Tyson hype leading into WrestleMania. Very interesting times. So let us jump into it. Through the use of the Pro Wrestlemania. February 16, 1998 Wrestling Observer Newsletter. Mike Tyson WrestleMania Press Conference tons more. By Observer staff. So now that we have the answer to the big question on Mike Tyson, it brings up the next question. Tyson's role, as announced by Vince McMahon at the beginning of a press conference at the official All-Star Cafe in Manhattan on February 5, would be as an outside-the-ring enforcer, a second referee of sorts, for the Shawn Michaels vs. Steve Austin main event at WrestleMania on March 29 in Boston's Fleet Center. The press conference was widely attended with some 27 television cameras and more than 100 reporters attending from all over the world, the timing of which was fortuitous for the WWF stemming from mainstream media reports nationwide coming the 2 days leading to the press conference of an apparent Mike Tyson-Don King business split over. What else? King taking so much of Tyson's money and leaving him near broke with a $7 million income tax bill to pay, and this was Tyson's first public appearance since the news broke. The press conference made virtually every major newspaper in the country, although most of the stories didn't focus much on pro wrestling other than the obligatory just how far Tyson has fallen comments and negative comments toward the wrestling industry and more on what the evil King did to a stupid Tyson once again. But the name WrestleMania and the date did make a lot of mainstream press that under normal circumstances would never mention it, even if the mentions were virtually all with an unmistakably sarcastic smirk. The WWF got almost no positive press out of this aside from a Bob Raceman column in the New York Daily News headlined Vince revels as king for a day. The story proclaimed McMahon as the big winner, saying he's already gotten full return on his investment because signing Tyson has put the spotlight in wrestling back on the WWF from the WCW, and the crossover publicity will bring new fans to their television sets and new fans to his arenas. Raceman at least understood the big picture as it related to wrestling, but the majority of coverage, besides the smirking talking heads on television, were proclaiming Tyson as one of the new Three Stooges, a phrase the WWF must have been particularly sensitive about since the New York Times Three Stooges headline actually aired on Raw on February 9. However, the word Stooges was whitewashed out of the clipping. Presumably the other two Stooges were Michaels and Austin, and not McMahon and King, who were knocked with lines like being either hair extension or steroid bloated phonies. There were the expected stories talking about how Tyson was sinking to a new low, actually quite similar to the news stories 3 years ago when Lawrence Taylor worked WrestleMania. It's really quite shallow anyone saying or thinking that to believe doing a pro wrestling gig was lower than biting Evander's ear twice, being a street thug, an alleged wife beater, or a convicted rapist. ESPN tuned out of the press conference within seconds, realizing it was mainly a pro wrestling hype job. Others, like Fox Sports and CNN-SI, gave it coverage throughout the day, with wrestling mentioned as an afterthought to the King/Tyson split as the real story. As bad as pro wrestling can be and often is, its horror stories pale in comparison to those in the so-called sweet science, where Tyson has been one of the few lucky ones to at least make large chunks of money on the way to every charismatic boxing champion's ultimate destination, being a special referee for pro wrestling, putting over a Japanese wrestler in a mixed match, or sticking around longer than Giant Baba, and either doing commercials for Meineke or showing up on Tuesday night fights against nobodies. The company reasonably couldn't and didn't expect a lot of positive press since the story combines pro wrestling, Don King, Mike Tyson and Vince McMahon. But the feeling is that Tyson's involvement would create a major awareness to the WWF and to the WrestleMania show, which it has. But for most wrestling fans, the announcement of Tyson as nothing more than an outside-the-ring sort of ref was a huge letdown after the hype in the Fresno angle. TCI Cable, which last week had actually threatened not to carry WrestleMania if Tyson's role would in any way adversely affect his boxing reinstatement, has agreed to carry the show now that Tyson's role was defined. Despite speculation to the contrary, and even statements by McMahon at the press conference hinting otherwise, this role had been the plan from the start, according to several who had been appraised of the conclusion of the story from the start. It appears that the belief originally was that they would tease an Austin vs. Tyson match after doing the angle in Fresno to gain tons of mainstream attention, which did work on a worldwide basis, probably even greater than their most optimistic expectations. Then show deference to the Nevada State Athletic Commission and perhaps ease his transition back into boxing by showing that deference, used that as the excuse to only use Tyson in the outside-the-ring ref role. The reason he's not the ref inside the ring is so he doesn't get in the way of Michaels and Austin's spots due to inexperience. When the commission didn't come down hard on Tyson being a participant in the match in the first place and become the so-called heels to the wrestling fans in the story, A major piece of the storyline puzzle was thrown for a loop, and from a storyline standpoint, there was no explanation even attempted by the WWF as to why both Tyson and Austin wanted the match, that there was no reason given not to have it, but that Tyson was only going to wind up as an outside-the-ring referee. There had been recent discussions between McMahon and the Nevada State Athletic Commission regarding this storyline snafu, but the commission wasn't willing to play along to that degree and be the so-called bad guys in this story. There was never any consideration given to Tyson being a participant in a match with Austin at WrestleMania or even a tag team match, even under very controlled circumstances, let alone whatever else had been speculated here and elsewhere over the past few weeks. No matter. From a wrestling standpoint, the next question is, will it all be worth it, since the drawing power of Tyson as an outside-the-ring ref won't exactly be the same as Tyson being a participant? Much of the New York media, which had been covering the story far closer than any other media in the country due to its long-term fascination with Tyson, had reported Tyson as receiving $3.5 million for the gig. At the press conference, Tyson claimed that figure was low, and the figure listed since that time has been $4 million. It is well known that Don King received $300,000 for the rights to Tyson's likeness, a fee which was said to have been the catalyst for the Tyson-King attempted split, and King was also paid by McMahon for helping promote the match and appearing on Raw. WWF sources claim that despite what Tyson said at the press conference, the $3.5 million figure is higher than the real number and that the company doesn't need a 2.0 buy rate to make a profit on the show. When WCW made attempts to sign Tyson, the total cost of everything, which included a lot of paying off a lot of people, would wind up supposedly being $6 million for the deal, a figure they felt wasn't economically feasible and why they quickly chose to pass on the deal. The printed figures for celebrities at WrestleMania have in the past been greatly inflated. William Refrigerator Perry was reported everywhere as getting $350,000 when the real figure was $135,000. Lawrence Taylor didn't receive the reported $1 million. And even Muhammad Ali, whose match with Antonio Inoki was back in the news due to Tyson, was reported in the New York media this past week as having received $6 million to do that 1976 match when he really received $1.8 million, although in his case he was really supposed to get $6 million for doing the job that he didn't do. One of the oldest tricks in boxing promoters dealing with boxers when it comes to big numbers is to give them a big hunk of cash up front immediately, which they understand and deal with from their upbringing in lieu of the check or in lieu delaying the payments for the promised amount of money, which is why the boxers in most cases never get anywhere near the purses you read about them getting in the newspaper and why such a high percentage of them wind up broke. As it turns out, unlike McMahon, Ted Turner probably wouldn't have been thrilled with this kind of negative publicity for his wrestling company, and even if WCW had agreed to terms with Tyson, there is no guarantee the higher-ups at Turner or Time Warner wouldn't have nixed it due to the media reaction it was going to receive. Last year, when WWF planned on using Dennis Rodman as their major celebrity, WCW outbid WWF for his services and got a lot of media attention for the company in doing so. Nevertheless, the attention WCW got with Rodman will and already has paled in comparison. Since Tyson's name was brought up on Raw, WCW first attempted to use Oscar de la Hoya as a referee, but de la Hoya's people nixed that deal because they felt it would hurt his image being involved with pro wrestling. WCW also opened negotiations in a later virtually unpublicized effort that didn't come to fruition involved attempting to get Evander Holyfield to referee the Hogan-Sting Cow Palace match. To answer the next question itself is complicated. First off, WWF has decided to raise the WrestleMania price from $29.95 to $34.95, which only slightly changes the economics from the last time we looked at it. One has to figure Tyson was already worth $750,000 to the WWF just for his part in the Royal Rumble buy rate. How much he's worth to the company when it comes to whatever, if any, TV ratings increase he's responsible for is hard to ascertain. How much he's worth to the company in the long run for raising the visibility of the company's top star, Austin, is also hard to ascertain, and for raising the visibility of Michaels, as he'll no doubt do since there are more angles planned in this story leading up to the match. More people are attending WWF house shows, but more people are also attending WCW, ECW and independent house shows as well, and Tyson's involvement in pro wrestling has nothing to do with that. More people are watching wrestling on television as WWF ratings are up, but WCW is still winning the ratings battles by about the same margin as before this angle came about. Still, if we take the package as being $4 million, which may be a low figure for the total overall cost, and take off $750,000 for what he helped draw already at the Rumble, while they can turn a profit on less than a 2.0 buy rate, they still need no less than a 2.0 buy rate, 567,000 buys, to make it worthwhile on the show itself, going under the impression that without Tyson's involvement that Michaels and Austin under the current boom economic conditions in wrestling were going to do a 1.2 on their own, and that may be a conservative assessment. WrestleManias have done figures in that range and quite a bit better in the past, although not in the last few years. From a standpoint of the buy rates on the two pay-per-view shows that Rodman did with WCW last year and how much he was paid, $750,000 per shot, it was really almost a wash, and generally speaking, the Lawrence Taylor angle was considered at the time a pay-per-view flop, even though both Rodman and Taylor in the ring did better than anyone had the right to expect from people going so long in their first professional match. Even with all the media pub, WCW with Rodman didn't do the buy rates, approximately 0.89 on both shows he worked, that the Hogan-Piper cage match did. It did maybe half of Hogan-Sting, and for that matter, was actually less than even the recent Flair-Hart, and Rodman was a participant in a match on the second of the two shows, both of which got a ton of mainstream hype going in. Taylor's match with Bigelow in 1995's WrestleMania, which was an excellent overall hype job going in, and he was a participant in the main event, drew an estimated 1.4 buy rate. Of course, Tyson's name is bigger than either Rodman or Taylor's, even more so on an international basis, and Bigelow just didn't get over to the mainstream like at least Austin has the potential of doing, and certainly wasn't over to the wrestling audience anywhere close to where Austin or Michaels are today. Would WCW, turning back the clock 1 year, make the deal again? I guarantee the answer is yes, for the visibility it gave the company and ego gratification of those involved of being perceived as a big-time business player, and the fact that Rodman's first appearance last March, also in an out-of-the-ring role, led to WCW's uncensored beating out last year's WrestleMania, which came 1 week later, when it came to pay-per-view buys. And the huge increase in interest in WCW over the past year, while it can't be all or even majorly attributed to the fact Rodman was involved in 2 pay-per-view shows and 1 Nitro, he was responsible for at least a small part in the company's overall growth last year. According to an article by Wallace Matthews in the February 4th New York Post, Tyson owes the government $7 million in taxes and is down to either $150,000 or $4 million in liquid assets, which would mean that WrestleMania payoff would come in handy, although it's 90 to 120 days after the event before he'll be getting whatever the money is that he's really getting. Tyson at the press conference naturally denied having any financial problems, saying he has more money than anyone could ever spend, and claiming it could take him 1 year to earn $200 million. The truth of Tyson's money woes appear to have been exaggerated, as between his 3 homes, his cars and trust funds for his wife and kids, his worth was estimated at between $70 million and $150 million. King, who was originally scheduled to appear at the WrestleMania press conference before his falling out with Tyson, was said to have been confronted by Tyson after Tyson's wife got information from the WWF that the WWF had paid King $300,000 for his likeness, which Tyson believed he himself owned. The Post story claimed that Tyson slapped and kicked King and banged him up pretty good in a confrontation outside the Hotel Bel Air in Los Angeles on January 31st, which Tyson sort of denied at the press conference, saying, "I would never strike anyone outside the paid profession. I won't even make a fist if they don't pay me." Reports indicated King paid the money back to Tyson, but that Tyson would rid himself of King and his co-managers, John Horn and Rory Holloway. At the press conference, McMahon told reporters that they were there to talk about WrestleMania, not about Tyson's personal life, although virtually nobody was there to talk about wrestling. The press conference was almost taken over by stuttering John Melendez of the Howard Stern Show, asking questions like, "What does an ear taste like?" and "Are you the first convicted rapist to appear in WrestleMania?" At other points, McMahon acted indignant when it became obvious the feeling in the room was that doing pro wrestling was beneath Tyson. The actual figures for the sold-out live house at the Fleet Center are 15,516 tickets, of which 14,758 were paid. They really limited comps this year, as usually they have thousands of them, since that's when they invite a lot of guests plus do a lot of media trades and the like, for a gate of $943,145. The latter figure naturally being an all-time record for Boston and the largest gate for U.S. pro wrestling in 4 years, since the 1994 WrestleMania at Madison Square Garden, and when all is said and done, this figure may end up topping that $960,000 figure. Mania will probably be an 8-match card with nothing that could be considered a surprise matchup based on the current storylines. The lineup itself isn't officially finalized, but obviously Undertaker vs. Kane is the semifinal, and you can easily figure what most of the matches are going to end up being based on current television, with only 1 or 2 preliminary exceptions that aren't finalized but that also would not be considered major by any definition. The show will consist of mostly matches to climax the feuds that are going around the horn currently, and the show itself will set up new feuds, rather than having a feud started in the next few weeks for Mania or having anyone not currently in the television storylines appearing in a participant role, with probably one exception in a preliminary role. The originally scheduled match between Mark Marrow and pro boxer Eric Butterbean Esch, with Butterbean competing as a pro wrestler, has been postponed until a later pay-per-view. The feeling is that with Tyson on the show, it makes no sense to use Butterbean. In real life, or at least as real life as the world of boxing is, there is also bad blood between the two. In addition, the working idea is to put on a good to great series of different style matches so that if Tyson brings some new curious people to the table, the WWF will be able to impress and entertain them and make new fans out of them. Michaels is being kept out of the ring to heal up and perform a match to impress whatever non-wrestling fans tune into the show, combined with Austin being in by far the biggest match of his life. The feeling is that if the two have a super match, and that Tyson gets maybe 2 or 3 spots in to make newscasts and the final spot to get a big pop, that all masters will be served. Obviously Marrow versus Butterbean wasn't going to be a good match, and the feeling is it would be better saved for a different show. WWF is attempting to contact, through the William Morris Agency, a list of sleazy celebrities to appear on the show, although the only name we know of that has confirmed at this point is Pete Rose, and his role in the show hasn't been decided. While Tyson's role in Mania is not expected to change, he is expected to be involved in 1 or possibly 2 more major angles that WWF is hoping to garner strong mainstream media attention out of, most likely taking place on live Raw shows on March 2nd in Cleveland and March 16th in Phoenix. No doubt at least one involving Shawn Michaels and DX. WWF is also hopeful of Tyson appearing on the Raw shows taped on March 3rd in Wheeling, West Virginia, and March 17th in Tucson, Arizona. Tyson wasn't expected at press time to appear in Houston for the pay-per-view on February 15th, and the decision was made not to use him at the Raw taping on February 16th in Dallas because that show won't air until 5 days later, and thus if they shot an angle, they'd either have to release the tape to the media before it airs, which USA Network wouldn't like and would expose their Saturday Raw show as having been taped, or get little media play out of the angle because by the time it airs it would be 5 days old. From what we believe, there's no definite commitment by Tyson to the WWF after Mania, but that whatever is to happen at Mania will probably be an open-ended story allowing Tyson one more pay-per-view appearance. Tyson's people, for obvious reasons, are very protective of his baddest man on the planet image that they want to use for merchandising, and a phrase the WWF is repeating often on its television, and the WWF isn't allowed to do anything in its storyline to jeopardize that image, nor would the company do anything in its storyline to jeopardize the perception of Austin as the baddest man on their planet. A return appearance would all depend upon how well the angle at Mania comes off and how the buy rate comes in as to whether it would be worth everyone's while to bring him back, since the cost would be considerable, and the novelty may be gone by that point. WCW still has one more match with Rodman under contract, and the feeling is at this point the novelty is gone and it would be hard to justify the price tag. Once Tyson returns to boxing, his reinstatement hearing is on July 5th. That would almost definitely spell the end of his involvement with the WWF. The WWF has 3 pay-per-view shows, April 26th in Greensboro, May 31st in Milwaukee, and June 28th in Pittsburgh. King of the Ring, between Mania and Tyson's hearing, the latter would be the most likely to be the one if there would be a return appearance. Michaels himself is going to be kept out of the ring until WrestleMania, with the exception of the pay-per-view match in Houston, to avoid the possibility of aggravating one of his existing injuries, but will appear at all the television tapings, and the plan at this point is for him to appear at a few arena shows, such as March 22nd Madison Square Garden, in Hunter Hearst Helmsley's corner for main events against Austin, as they will be doing a storyline of Helmsley and DX attempting to injure Austin before the Mania match. Michaels repeated his line at the press conference about not laying down for anyone, which should guarantee that he's begrudgingly going to put Austin over in the title match. The Tyson-King split may not be as easy as has been indicated, since King has Tyson under contract for 4 more fights. The Post story indicated Tyson might use documentation over his financial situation as leverage to get out of the deal, since King himself has a retrial scheduled for next month on mail fraud charges. During the press conference, both Michaels and Austin made statements that basically challenged Tyson, with Tyson, used to this sort of situation from boxing press conferences, not backing down. Michaels said that if Tyson got in his way, he'd be glad to kick his teeth out, while Austin said he'd put on the gloves and beat the hell out of Tyson, and still hinted about a possible future confrontation, while many in the media smirked about the idea a fake wrestler could really win a fight against a ferocious warrior, even though, much to the chagrin of many of the reporters in attendance, the odds are great that at least one, if not more, of the current WWF stable would have to be favored in a legitimate confrontation with Tyson, although Michaels certainly wouldn't be on that list. It built to Michaels and Austin challenging each other and looking as if they wanted to go at it, with Tyson and Shane McMahon, who is said to now be a close confidant of Tyson's, holding them apart. As this was going on, because Tyson had his back to the multitude of TV cameras during the key scene of the show, Vince McMahon screamed, "Ring the F!" in bell. Whoops. Wrong story. Actually, he screamed, "Turn around, Mike." Tyson isn't the only boxing legend involved with pro wrestling that week. New Japan Pro Wrestling announced on February 10 that Muhammad Ali would be appearing as a special guest on its April 4 show at the Tokyo Dome for Antonio Inoki's retirement match. It should be noted that in 1996 Inoki had indicated that Ali would be making an appearance as a guest at his World Wrestling Peace Festival in Los Angeles, and then his people gave an excuse that Ali was under the weather when he didn't appear. The idea is that New Japan would bring in many of Inoki's famous opponents of the past to witness his final match. No other names were announced, but it is believed people like Dory Funk, Lou Thesz, Willem Ruska, Olympic judo gold medalist, who had a few famous matches with Inoki in the late 70s, Shota Chakayashvili, Russian judo champion who Inoki put over at the very first Tokyo Dome show in 1988, and Karl Gotch will be invited to appear. Although it was considered one of the worst matches in history when it actually took place, Inoki's match with Ali, which was basically a shoot on June 25, 1976 from Budokan Hall because Ali refused to do the original finish of him losing and the two sides couldn't come up with a finish and just went into the ring, has in time grown into more legendary proportions simply because it actually did take place, was a shoot, was a predecessor to the world of NHB that is popular now, and Inoki personally considers it the most memorable match of his career. The 15-round draw carried worldwide on closed-circuit television saw Inoki mainly on his back kicking at Ali's legs for most of the fight, in which Ali only landed 6 punches. Even as recently as the current issue of Black Belt magazine, the match was pointed out with them misspelling Inoki's name as Inoke, as being the first example to the American public that pro boxers really weren't the toughest all-around fighters, not pointing out how bad the match was, but noting that Ali was hospitalized after the match because of the toll all the leg kicks took on him, and those close to him have pointed to the match as a factor in Ali's physical decline when it came to mobility after that point. It was also announced that on the March tour that New Japan would hold an 8-man single elimination tournament with the winner to be Inoki's opponent on the final show. There is a very interesting story behind the scenes on this one, and that most of the top wrestlers in New Japan like Masahiro Chono, Shinya Hashimoto and Kensuke Sasaki don't want to be involved in the tournament or the scenario. The belief is that the tournament is to give Naoya Ogawa credibility as Inoki's final match, and the top guys don't want to have to put Ogawa over now that Ogawa as a pro wrestler is no longer a novelty. The only names announced thus far in the tournament are Ogawa and Don Frye, and that the finals will be on March 22 in Nagoya. Coming off a record rating for a head-to-head show on February 2 with a 4.93 rating and 7.51 share, WCW Nitro followed it up on February 9 with not only its best Nitro show but also its strongest from a marquee match standpoint of the year, with a double headliner with Hulk Hogan vs. Randy Savage and the Steiners winning the WCW tag titles from Kevin Nash and Scott Hall, which drew a 4.60, 4.83 first hour, 4.43 seconds hour, 4.55 third hour rating and 6.91 share. Raw drew a 3.45 rating and 5.32 share on February 2, followed by a 3.20 rating, 3.20 first hour, 3.20 seconds hour, and 4.79 share on February 9. The Nitro replays were a 1.0 rating and 4.8 share on February 2, and a 1.2 rating and 5.5 share on February 9. Since the Nitro replays have been moved to a 1 a.m. to 4 a.m. slot, the ratings aren't going to ever be what they were. Ironically, the movie in between the two Nitro showings on February 9 was Muhammad Ali, The Whole Story, which did a 1.7. The 4.93 rating on February 2 would be the second highest in the history of Nitro, trailing only the 4.97 rating on August 25, which was a week when Raw was preempted for tennis. There was a lot of feeling that with the marquee lineup on February 9 combined with all the momentum the company has, that they would top a 5.0 rating, since what has been the key force in the WCW ratings of late has been the Randy Savage split from the NWO, and this, going against Hogan, would be the strongest match in that storyline possible. That didn't happen, probably because of the Olympics, which did a 14.7 head-to-head, which is slightly better than NFL football averaged during the season in the same head-to-head slot, so the ratings have to be compared to NFL season levels, and a 4.6 would be considered great by those standards. Since the Raw rating also dropped, although WCW was coming off week television shows the previous Monday and Thursday. There is also a lot of feeling that on February 16th, with Raw preempted by the Westminster Dog Show, that Nitro would break its all-time record even going against the Olympics. Nitro's big number combined a 5.23 first hour, a 4.63 seconds hour and a 4.95 third hour. The Raw marks on February 2nd were a 3.75 first hour and a 3.15 seconds hour. The numbers were a big coup for WCW considering Raw had easily the better show that night. The angle with the New Age Outlaws throwing Cactus Jack and Terry Funk over the edge of the ramp in the dumpster was a big success, as the match itself drew a 3.9 rating and the post-match scene of chaos drew a 4.0 mark. There was some concern that much dead time with a competitive wrestling show going on would hurt ratings, but that didn't turn out to be the case. But while the angle did keep a lot of people glued to Raw, when it was over, even though Billy Gunn had a singles match with Owen Hart next, the Raw number started a big decline to a 3.5 and fell as low as a 2.9 during the second hour for the NWA segment with Jeff Jarrett and Barry Windham versus Flash Funk and Blackjack Bradshaw before picking up to a 3.0 for the Vader Kane Fire Extinguisher angle and the Steve Austin versus Jesse Jam Quickie match with all the run-ins. There were those in the WWF perplexed about how they could reach a 4.0 level and still have Austin in a match saved for the end of the show and the rating could drop 25%. It may be a fluke or it may be crying wolf, as how many months has it been where nearly every week Austin is promised to wrestle and somehow he never does. With the marquee competition of Sting versus Randy Savage, which fans knew was really going to take place over yet another tease of an Austin match, which as it turned out only lasted 39 seconds anyway, WCW took the final quarter by a 5.1 to 3.0 margin. The 9:30 p.m. to 9:45 p.m. segment did set a total viewing audience record for Monday Night Wrestling, totaling an 8.8 rating or 6,357,000 homes, as WCW did a 4.8 for Scott Hall versus Jim Neidhart and WWF did a 4.0 for the post angle with Funk and Cactus, barely breaking the quarter-hour record set just a few weeks earlier. WCW's number was paced by going in with a large audience in the unopposed first hour. The rating hovered between a 4.8 and 5.1 for the final 90 minutes with no major peaks nor valleys, as even Sting vs. Savage at 5.1 was not a major increase over two earlier segments that did 5.0s, Goldberg vs. Mark Starr and Davey Boy Smith vs. Steve McMichael in one segment, Steiners vs. Marcus Bagwell and Nash in another. The feeling here that the edge was taken off the February 2nd Big Raw angle when it turned into a Three Stooges cartoon with Funk in his grungy underwear and hospital robe and Jack holding an IV in his arm making the run-in at the end of the show was pretty well echoed universally as the week went on. Apparently having Funk and Jack do the run-in at the end was a McMahon call, but then again, so was the angle in the first place that almost everyone liked. Some didn't because they thought it looked too safe, which thankfully it was. Let's be realistic. Funk is almost 54 and has been wrestling a hard style for 33 years and is working with injuries that would probably cripple any normal person. It would be criminal to not do a totally safe angle with him just so a few people would think it looked more realistic. Michaels collapsed and wasn't even touched the last time they tried to do a serious angle, and that drew huge money on his return. Perhaps then it was in WWF's best interest of sorts that so much of the audience that viewed the initial angle and more importantly the reaction to it had already turned off Raw by the time the end of the show run-in took place. In comparing the quarters on February 9th you can see more of a story. The head-to-head period started with WCW at 4.3, Eddie Guerrero and Jericho versus Chavo Jr. and Malenko, to 3.4, Austin interview/DX in dressing room and Austin showing he stole belt plus beginning of LOD versus Windham and Jarrett. Then it was WCW at 4.3, Dandy vs. Guerrero and beginning of Regal vs. Goldberg, to 3.3, ending of LOD vs. Windham and Jarrett and Henry Godwin vs. Pierre, WCW gained to a 4.7, ending of Regal vs. Goldberg and Spicoli vs. Adams, while WWF fell to 2.8. Christopher and Pantera vs. Michinoku and Aguila, WCW fell to 4.4, Dragon vs. Saturn, while WWF gained to 3.3, Kane and Bearer interview, beginning of Shamrock and Chains vs. Maivia and Farouk, WCW went to 4.3. Booker T vs. Raven's Nest angle, while WCW grew to 3.6, ending of Shamrock and Chains vs. Maivia and Farouk and Tyson press conference, WCW got the big edge with a 5.1, Hogan vs. Savage, while WWF fell to 2.8. Recon vs. Blackman with Jackal speaking on the pulpit, the gap closed slightly to 4.5, Luger coming out, Savage attacking, Sting out, net dropping an NWO survey, to 3.0 Outlaws reenacting the angle and Austin locking Barrique was in a room, and finally it was 4.3, Steiners vs. Hall and Nash, to 3.4. Goldust vs. Thrasher and DX/Outlaws final brawl with Austin and company. What does that mean? Nothing we don't already know. The WWF light heavyweights aren't over. Tyson's press conference meant more than any of the WWF wrestlers. Hogan vs. Savage was what the public cared about, although WWF putting on nothing against it didn't hurt the quarter domination. And Steiners vs. Hall and Nash was, survey says, a disappointment. The WWF had one major cause for celebration besides the Tyson press conference, as February 6th in St. Louis at Kiel Center they drew a whopping 20,138 fans, of which 18,877 paid $275,289. It was the largest gate in the long and storied history of St. Louis wrestling, although not the largest crowd, although it was one of the 3 or 4 largest. It was the typical house show with Cactus Jack and Chainsaw Charlie and Austin over New Age Outlaws and Rocky Maivia as the main event, although the original match advertised that sold most of the tickets was actually Undertaker and Austin vs. Shawn Michaels and Hunter Hearst Helmsley. Japanese television rundown. January 11th, All Japan. 1. Akira Taue and Kantaro Shiga beat Jun Izumida and Tamon Honda in 12:36 as part of the Asunaro Cup tournament. Match had no heat at all and was for the most part real bad. At one point Izumida used Taue's own choke slam on him. For the finish, Taue used the choke slam on Izumida, and for humiliation, threw little Shiga on top of him for the pin. The crowd did pop for seeing Shiga pin Izumida, as they didn't expect that. 1/4 of 1 star. 2. Mitsuharu Misawa and Jun Akiyama and Manukia Mossman beat Steve Williams and Gary Albright and Ricky Santana in 14:12. Mossman and Santana attempted to work a hot series of spots to build up their junior title feud, but they just weren't that good together. Mossman used a diamond cutter, which the announcers called a chin crusher. Finish saw Akiyama pin Santana after his exploder suplex. 1 1/2 star. January 18th, All Japan. 1. Akiyama and Takao Omori beat Taue and Shiga in the Asunaro Cup tournament in 17:35. The last 6 minutes or so aired on television. What aired was pretty good. Crowd heat was down, but it did pick up as the match got good. Real good spots with Taue versus Akiyama. Finish saw Omori pin Shiga after the old Ray Stevens bombs away knee drop off the top rope. 3 1/4 stars. 2. Williams and Albright and Wolf Hockfield beat Kenta Kobashi and Johnny Ace and Mossman in 17:17. Bad at some points and very good in other points. At one point Ace and Hockfield were downright pathetic. But toward the finish the match did pick up, although Hockfield looked very green a lot of the time. Mossman did a great DDT on Hockfield, dropping him right on the top of his head. Finish saw Hockfield pin Mossman after a whirly bird slam similar to the old Whatever Happened to Al Perez helicopter finisher. 2 1/4 stars. January 24th, New Japan. This show didn't air any matches but was a career retrospective on Riki Choshu for the second straight week. It aired all kinds of still photos and match finishes of some of the memorable matches of his career. One interesting thing which shows a difference between US and Japanese culture is that when Choshu, who, along with many of his contemporaries like Animal Hamaguchi, Tatsumi Fujinami and Antonio Inoki, was interviewed during the show, he was smoking. In late December, when All Japan did its year-end show with the top 10 matches of the year, Mitsuharu Misawa vs. Kenta Kobashi from October 21st was their pick, was the best match of the year. Kira Taue was also smoking and several of the guys were drinking beer. In the US, you rarely see any athlete smoke while doing a television interview. I'm not talking about Sandman where it's his gimmick, but someone treated as a real athlete, as the Japanese wrestlers are respected as. They also showed some very rare footage, such as a clip of Fujinami and Choshu versus Dick Murdoch and Dusty Rhodes as the Texas Outlaws from the late 70s, and the finish of Choshu's UWA title win over Connect from Naucalpan, Mexico in 1982. It was interesting in retrospect how all of Choshu's heated finishes looked so ordinary, in that he spent a career really only doing 3 moves, Scorpion, Lariat and back suplex, and just how much the general quality of work has increased, at least at the top level in Japan, when you look back at what were classic matches when they were held 15 years ago. They also introduced Choshu's children to television for the first time. Without knowing a word anyone was saying, this appeared to be a very well put together show. January 25th, All Japan. 1. Giant Kimala 2 pinned Skull Von Crush in 13:25. Only the second half aired on television. No heat most of the way. Lots of near falls at the end. It was Von Crush's first television match, aside from the Battle Royal, and he didn't show anything special but didn't look bad either. 1 star. 2. Misawa and Satoru Asako beat Toshiaki Kawada and Masao Inoue in 26-18 in the Asunaro Cup tournament. The last 17 minutes aired on television. Most of the focus was on Inoue versus Asako. They weren't bad but got no heat. When Misawa was in against Kawada it was great, but they kept those to a minimum. Turned into a good match ending when Asako pinned Inoue after a Frankensteiner off the top rope. 2.5 stars. January 31st, New Japan. 1. Liger and Hayato Nanjo beat Takaiwa and Otani in 16-11 when Liger pinned Takaiwa after 3 palm strikes. The last half of the match aired on television, and it was very good, but not at the top level of the New Japan Junior matches. Nanjo looked good in his debut, including using a Michinoku driver, which they called by that name, and a fireman's carry dropped into a Northern Lights bomb which was called a Hurricane driver. Takaiwa did his standard multiple power bomb spot on both before doing the job for the finish. 3.5 stars. 2. Sasaki and Yamazaki and Hirata beat Nishimura and Kojima and Nakanishi in 13:54. Again, only the second half aired. Most of the focus was on Sasaki versus Nishimura to build up their title match. It was a good stiff fast-paced match ending when Sasaki pinned Kojima after a brainbuster. 3 stars. 3. Muto and NWO Sting beat Hashimoto and Yasuda in 12:39. Again the second half aired. Yasuda looked pretty bad and Sting didn't look good either. At one point when the two were in with each other missing spots the fans were laughing at them. Muto and Hashimoto looked good enough to keep it from being a terrible match. Sting pinned Yasuda after a sloppy clothesline off the top rope. 1.5 star. 4. Koshinaka and Nagami and Akitoshi Saito and Kimura beat Goto and Ohara and Chono and Tenzan in 13:32. Really not much of a match. Match ending with Goto and Ohara turning on Chono and Tenzan, and helping out high. Tenzan and Ohara were arguing and Ohara came off the top with a clothesline on Tenzan while Goto used his back suplex on Chono. He whipped Chono into a butt bump by Koshinaka. Koshinaka used the butt bump on Tenzan and Koshinaka, Goto and Ohara did a triple team power bomb on Tenzan for the pin. After the match, Big Titan did the run-in with the lights out to kind of clean house using the choke slam as his finisher. Titan looked pretty bad in doing so, as he didn't work well with the guys and they didn't sell his lousy offense very creditably either. 2 stars. February 1st, All Japan. 1. Misawa pinned Akiyama in 23:09 to retain the Triple Crown. This was the first major television match of the year in the promotion, and it was the best television match of the year thus far. A totally different style but better than either Rey Mysterio Jr. versus Juventud Guerrera or Ultimo Dragon versus Shinjiro Otani. Crowd was really into it early with a fast start which climaxed when Akiyama hit the exploder suplex but Misawa rolled out of the ring. Akiyama gave him a tombstone piledriver on the floor and back in the ring delivered a flying forearm for a near fall. The match slowed from the 5-minute mark until the 11-minute mark, which was the only bad point of the match, with Akiyama mainly working over Misawa's neck. Misawa made a brief comeback to liven things up, but he was cut off by a Northern Lights suplex, a pedigree, called a reverse full Nelson drop, and an elbow off the top to the back. Akiyama did a rolling German suplex with 2 Germans and the third turned into a Dr. Bomb, gut wrench into a power bomb, for a near fall. Misawa came back using an elbow suicida, tope ending with a flying elbow smash, followed by a full body splash from inside the ring over the top rope to the floor and a drop kick off the top rope and a German suplex for a near fall. Akiyama came back with a dragon screw, then had Misawa on his shoulders and dropped his face on the mat. Then came the hottest sequence of the match and of the year this far, with Akiyama appearing to have Misawa up for a high power bomb, but instead dropped him behind him on the top turnbuckle similar to a hot shot. He followed with a German suplex, a running high knee and an exploder, one right after the other, working the crowd into a fever pitch, and they popped huge, particularly when Misawa kicked out. Akiyama delivered a second exploder for another near fall. Akiyama then teased doing his exploder off the top rope, but Misawa blocked it and Akiyama instead did a belly-to-belly superplex followed by a brainbuster for another near fall. He then threw another exploder. Misawa rolled in midair, landing on his feet and threw an elbow. Misawa delivered a series of moves ending with his Tiger Driver, but Akiyama kicked out. As he tried another Tiger Driver, Akiyama turned it into another belly-to-belly. Misawa cut him off with a running elbow and then picked him up, inventing his new move, which is basically a tombstone piledriver, but instead of dropping the man in front of you, you've got him picked up to your right side and then drop him like a tombstone for the pin. 4.5 stars. Mexico. Well, whatever relations there were supposed to be between Promo Azteca and EMLL are done once again. The two sides had a non-rating agreement to the point that Azteca wasn't going to take Lizmark and Pepe Arguello, but all agreements are off as Lizmark and Arguello are both now expected to jump to Azteca while Pantera, same Pantera as in the WWF, has quit Azteca to join EMLL to work higher on the cards alongside Felino. In what could be the biggest move of all, Azteca was having serious meetings with Dr. Wagner Jr., who is probably the top heel right now in EMLL in national ratings. The Azteca show has been doing very well, in the 4.8 to 5.8 range the past few weeks, which is more than double what they were getting when they debuted in their new regular morning time slot, but is still being beaten out in the rings within the Distrito Federal by the /A/EMLL block on Televisa by a 3.8 to 3.0 margin. There is a major show on February 13th in Tijuana headlined by Promo Azteca vs. EMLL with Conan and Psicosis and Villano Cinco vs. El Hijo del Santo and Blue Panther and Negro Casas, plus Kiss vs. Sueño Chicano in a mask vs. mask match, Azteca Brazos vs. Mercenaries and Rey Mysterio and Super Parka vs. Damien and Pierroth Jr. Shocker and Mr. Niebla won a tag team tournament beating Wagner and Emilio Charles Jr. in the finals. Azteca's big show of the week was February 6th in Nezahualcóyotl, starting up a new feud with El Texano vs. Zorro, plus continuing the current programs including Mr. Aguila vs. Mosco, Tinieblas Jr. vs. Pirata Morgan, Oro Jr. vs. Jurassico, and Super Crazy vs. Venom Black. The major EMLL show of the past week was February 6th at Arena Mexico, which would be the first Arena Mexico card of 1998, with Karloff Lagarde Jr. winning the CMLL welterweight title from Mascara Magica in the main event. The co-feature was Lizmark and Atlantis and La Fiera vs. Wagner and Bestia Salvaje and Charles Jr. They'll be running the next 9 Fridays at Arena Mexico before taking a 1-month break in April for Holiday on Ice. AAA had 2 major shows this week. On February 5th in Toluca, it was headlined by Heavy Metal vs. Sangre Chicana in a cage match and Dos Carson, Goku and Mascara Sagrada vs. The Killer and Cyborg and Chiba, while February 7th in Torreon had Pero Arguello and Latin Lover and Octagon vs. Cibernetico and Cobarde and Pentagon, Heavy vs. Chicana in a chain match and Pero Arguello Jr. and Blue Demon Jr. and Oscar Sevilla vs. Picudo and Black Demon and Mohicano. Azteca TV taping on February 13th in Octopan Hidalgo has Vampiro Canadiense and Mascara Sagrada and Lizmark Jr. and Tinieblas Jr. vs. Black Magic and Pirata Morgan and Silver King and Villano Tres, Super Astro and Salsero and Tarzan Boy and Zorro vs. Juventud Guerrera and El Texano and Dandy and Jerry Estrada, Mr. Aguila and Venom Black and Super Muñeco and Super Colo vs. Super Crazy and Mosco de la Merced and Pantera del Ring and Brazo de Platino and Super Electra and Oro Jr. and Shiryu vs. Jurassico and Halloween and El Hijo del Diablo. With the overall economy having picked up, business is strong, particularly in the northern part of the country. However, within the Distrito Federal, which is where most of the television is taped, the crowds are still small. AAA has a hot valet feud, which is the first time they've really been able to put that angle together, with Rossi Moreno vs. Miss Janeth, both as heels. Highlights of the Azteca taping from January 30th in Guadalajara. Main event saw Silver King and Dandy beat Vampiro Canadiense and Black Magic when Vampiro accidentally clobbered Magic, basically breaking up their team so Vampiro can go back babyface. They continued the Juventud Guerrera vs. Tarzan Boy deal, leading to a mask versus hair situation, although who knows about anything right now, when Guerrera hit Tarzan Boy with a chair, leading to a DQ finish in Villano Tres and Jerry Estrada and Pirata Morgan vs. Tarzan Boy and Lizmark Jr. and Tinieblas Jr. The highlight flying match, not quite as good as the previous week, was Mosco de la Merced and Super Crazy and Pantera del Ring and Guerrera beating Pantera and Salsero and Venom Black and Mr. Aguila. Highlights included Venom doing a corkscrew plancha over the ring post, a 450 dropkick, Aguila doing a double springboard moonsault, Venom on Crazy's shoulders and going backwards with a reverse Frankentoyota, and Guerrera showing his studying of Raw videotapes, using the Stone Cold Stunner as his finisher. Paco Alonso and Jose Pianono Medina announced that the focus of the year at EMLL would be to unify all the existing championships, the NWA, CMLL, WWA and even Mexican national champions in each weight class, into just simply one world champion, which of course would be the CMLL title. The first belt they are looking at unifying would be in the welterweight division, with the unification expected during the summer. Even though the NWA belts and the national titles have the most history, The NWA is for all real purposes dead as an organization on the international level, and the other groups they are looking at unifying such as WWA and IWAS also really no longer exist on any significant level. All Japan. Most of the hype continues to surround the Tokyo Dome show. Johnny Ace worked the WWF TV tapings in Indianapolis doing a tryout match but didn't come in with any kind of counterproposal. While neither side has ruled out doing business with the other, the sides remain far apart and there is some bitterness on both sides due to the lack of interest and understanding of their respective businesses. From a WWF standpoint, they've put a lot of heat on Fumi Saito, the bilingual writer for Weekly Pro Wrestling, who was there both to serve as Giant Baba's interpreter and also for his knowledge of the American wrestling scene. At this point they claim they don't want to do any negotiations if Saito is involved because they felt he was confrontational. The basic gist appears that Saito pointed out that the mainstream pro wrestling fans in Japan isn't all that familiar with the WWF wrestlers except for Vader and Ken Shamrock. Actually, the Road Warriors would fit into that category, although it doesn't appear either side was that interested in them being a major part of the deal, who made their names originally in Japan. The only WWF television in Japan is on a satellite station that is only available in 500,000 homes in the entire country, so you've got to figure at most 20,000 homes are reached each week. However, when WWF officials Gerald Briscoe and Bruce Pritchard went to Japan and saw Steve Austin on the cover of several newspapers from the Tyson angle and saw wrestling magazines in which there were color photos of WWF major events and saw things a different way, some in WWF felt that Baba himself went into the meeting with little or no knowledge of the WWF product and its stars, which no doubt is true, while from a Japanese standpoint there was the same thought in regard to Briscoe and Pritchard coming in with no understanding of All Japan, the Japanese wrestling business, and felt insulted by their lack of knowledge going in as to even meet Tsuharu Misawa, Toshiaki Kawada, and Kenta Kobashi. Baba apparently also felt that if he was at the negotiating table as company president, then Vince McMahon should have been there as well, since he's the one, not Pritchard and Briscoe, who can finalize any deals. As mentioned before, the two sides were far apart on money. WWF appears right now to be under the impression that Baba wanted their top guys at the same price he paid his top foreigners like Stan Hansen, Steve Williams, and Gary Albright, and the top WWF talent is worth more in value in the United States to them for a weekend in the US than what that figure would be. Of course, WWF originally came in asking for $1 million for a package deal for maybe 8 to 12 wrestlers, which was an offer Baba apparently felt was so out of line that he wouldn't even respond to it with a counter. There are also others trying to work as kind of intermediaries or go-betweens to salvage at least getting Undertaker, Vader, and Shamrock to work the Dome show. The working plan now for the Dome show is to do almost an all-Japanese show, with the possible exception of using Gladiator from FMW. Since it's between tours, there is a lot of thought that Hansen, Williams, Ace, etc. wouldn't even be brought in for the show. There has been consideration given to Koji Kiao versus Akira Taue, although that is far from a done deal. Kiao won't be working a test show in February because he's training for a Shidokan karate match on March 22nd in Australia. Baba had a meeting this week with Atsushi Onita. Onita actually wanted to do an explosive match against Baba, but Baba made it clear this was All Japan and they don't do those kind of gimmicks, and while recognizing Onita as a promoter, doesn't want him wrestling on the show. Onita brought up sending the Gladiator as the lone foreigner on the Dome show, and Baba told the press that he needs to see him wrestle first and invited him to work some All Japan shows as tryouts. Baba did say that he would welcome using Hayabusa and Jinsei Shinzaki on the Dome show, and there is some talk that they would challenge Johnny Smith and Wolf Hockfield for the All-Asian Tag Team titles on that show. Besides the regular crew appearing in some shows on the next tour, which is February 14th to February 28th, are Yoshihiro Takayama and Masahito Kakihara, his All Japan debut from Kingdom, Daisuke Ikeda and Muhammad Yone, Satoshi Oniyama, from Battle Arts, Deto and Jado, who worked the entire tour in mid-card bouts, Kamikaze and Hiroyoshi Katsubo from Wrestle Dream Factory, and Shigeo Okamura from New Tokyo Pro Wrestling, most of whom would be doing basically tryouts for slots on the Dome show. Tour opens February 14th at Korakuen Hall with Misawa and Jun Akiyama and Manukiya Mossman versus Kobashi and Ace and Smith, Taue and Takawamori versus Williams and Albright, Hansen and Bobby Duncombe Jr. versus Kawada and Tomo and Honda, Geto and Jado versus Yoshinari Ogawa and Yoshinobu Kanemaru, and Kamikaze and Katsubo versus Satoru Asako and Masao Inoue. They have a major show on February 20th in Hiroshima with Misawa and Akiyama versus Kobashi and Ace, Kawada versus Albright, Taue versus Hockfield, and Geto and Jado versus Ogawa and Tsuyoshi Kikuchi. The biggest show is February 28th at Budokan with Misawa vs. Ace for the Triple Crown. Kawada and Taue defend the tag titles against Williams and Albright in Kobashi, and Akiyama vs. Takayama and Kakihara. January 25th TV show did a 2.5 rating. New Japan. Biggest highlight of the week was Jushin Liger regaining the IWGP Junior title for a record 9th time, beating Shinjiro Otani with a Fisherman Buster in 23:08 on February 7th in Sapporo. The two nights in Sapporo drew a sellout of 6,500 the first night and a near sellout of 6,000 on February 8th. Traditionally, New Japan has sold out both nights every February when it does the two straight nights in the same building gig. The first night also saw two other title matches. Kensuke Sasaki retained the IWGP Heavyweight title in the main event, beating Osamu Nishimura in 25:30 with a lariat. The report we got is that it was a major style clash and the first part of the match was so bad fans were actually booing the match. About the 20-minute mark, it was said that Nishimura delivered 8 straight springboard drop kicks and the rest of the match was really hot, so overall it was considered a decent match. Keiji Muto and Masahiro Chono retained the IWGP Tag Team titles, beating Satoshi Kojima and Manabu Nakanishi in 21:25 when Chono pinned Kojima. They also held a 2 out of 3 fall match on that show with Team NWO of Hiroyoshi Tenzan and Big Titan NWO Sting and Scott Norton beating Tadao Yasuda and Junji Hirata and Kazuo Yamazaki and Shinya Hashimoto. The second night featured 2 notable injuries. The main event was a 2 out of 3 fall 12-man tag match where Team NWO over Tenzan and Titan and NWO Sting and Chono and Muto and Norton beat Yasuda and Nishimura and Kojima and Nakanishi and Hashimoto and Sasaki in 28:21 when Norton pinned Hashimoto to win the third fall. During the match, Muto blew out his left knee. Apparently he is going to be out of action until February 15th, where he'll work the Budokan Hall show and then rest up for the next tour. The other injury was in a prelim match where Tatsuhito Takaiwa pinned Hayato Nangio, and sometime during the match Nangio suffered a broken jaw, and he'll be out of action about 1 month. There were 3 other important singles matches in Sapporo, with Kendo Kashin beating Otani with the armbar in 11:05, Liger pinning Koji Kanemoto in 22:30, and Tatsumi Fujinami beating Shiro Koshinaka with a figure 4 leglock submission in 11:45. Hashimoto vs. Titan was added to the February 15th Budokan Hall show. After winning the junior title, Liger said that he was breaking up his masked trio with Kashin and El Samurai because he was going to have to defend his title against both of them soon, although intimated that Kanemoto would be getting the first shot since apparently the Liger-Kanemoto match on February 8th was great. They are doing an angle where they are going to introduce an NWO referee probably on February 15th. In the 12-man tag, Chono hit the first ref, and then soon-to-be-retired ref Pete Takahashi came out and he was hit by Sting's baseball bat. Chono also said that once Inoki retires on April 4th, that with Inoki no longer an active competitor, that the promotion would start changing to a new, probably more Americanized, style. There may be a movement to slowly change the heel group's name from NWO, which is owned by WCW, to Aerostrist, which is a clothing line in Japan actually put together by Chono's wife, which will have its own t-shirts and a triangle-like necklace. Chono is already making himself along with Titan as a spin-off Aerostrist group within the NWO, preparing for if something were to happen with the WCW deal and they couldn't use the NWO name. Although Riki Choshu doesn't like using foreign wrestlers prominently, guys like Chris Benoit and Eddie Guerrero work as mid-card guys, and because they are so good in the ring are basically considered almost as Japanese wrestlers, so that isn't meant to mean all foreigners. And since New Japan has been very successful of late, it has become more of a common thought process. The feeling is they can use one big foreigner as a regular, which is where Titan fits in, because they know they are getting less dates on Norton and Marcus Bagwell this year. WCW is trying to push for Norton to get the IWGP Heavyweight title this year, but there are political problems there. When Norton worked exclusively for New Japan, he was protected, and actually the guys in Japan knew how to work with him to make him look like a superstar. However, fans now know that he's just a mid-card guy in the US, so his superstar aura was faded a great deal in Japan. I guess there is a saying of sorts in New Japan about most of the heavyweight foreigners that come in being shitty workers, and when they're in the ring with them, it's up to the Japanese to basically clean up their shit while in the match. High Voltage is mainly working undercards, although they did do a 6-man tag with Tatsumi Fujinami as their partner. Chaos is now wearing long dreadlock hair extensions similar to Road Dogg. January 24th TV show did a 2.3 rating. Other Japan notes. This didn't get a lot of pub in Japan and we don't have much in the way of details, but Rings ran its annual big show in Amsterdam, Holland that Chris Dolman always promotes on February 8th before a reported sellout crowd of 7,500. We only have sketchy details of the show at press time. There was a huge upset in the main event as Paul Verlins of UFC fame, trimmed down to 260 pounds under the training of Frank Shamrock just 7 days after taking a beating from Nick Nutter in Brazil, knocked out local hero Dick Frey in the second round of a match that was fought entirely on their feet, with neither attempting to take the other down, and said to have been a war. Rings runs every year at this time in Holland with all-shoot matches and has sold out the past several years. The shows are usually the wildest ring show of the year because they use mainly Dutch kickboxing types as opposed to ground specialists or more well-rounded fighters. The only 2 Japanese fighters on the show were Tsuyoshi Kosaka, who beat Rob van Adank of Holland in 57 seconds of the second round with a heel hook submission, and Wataru Sakata, who went to a non-decision with Willie Peters when apparently Peters committed a major foul. FMW wants to bring in some wrestlers from ECW from April 21st to April 30th, with the latter date being a show at Yokohama Bunka Gym. The names they're most interested in are Shane Douglas and Francine. Since ECW has a pay-per-view show on May 3rd, this may be difficult. Actually, it is said that Onita's major goal for 1998 is to introduce the Explosive Bomb match to the United States, and it's a real big deal to him to try and get it on the August ECW pay-per-view show. War President Masatomo Takei was scheduled to make an announcement on February 11th, which would be the planned final card for the promotion, about the future of the group and the wrestlers. There is some talk of keeping the office open and booking the wrestlers under contract to different groups, and maybe still running some shows, as they have Korakuen Hall booked in March and some cities booked through June. In December, Genichiro Tenryu opened a sushi restaurant, and the feeling is that he can't retire from wrestling because what gives the restaurant its business is that it's Tenryu's, and that Tenryu would be the type that once his disappears from wrestling, his name will fade away. Great Sasuke had his knee operation on February 7th and the surgery was said to have been successful. Pancrase ran February 6th at Yokohama Bunka Gym before 4,800. They had 5 matches with the members of the Tokyo Dojo against the Yokohama Dojo, with the actual matches not picked until they got in the ring. The first 2 matches, Keiichiro Yamamiya of Tokyo vs Ryushi Yanagisawa and Kyuma Kunyoku of Tokyo vs Yuki Kondo, ended up as 13-minute draws. Yokohama then won the next 2, Masami Shibuya over Yoshiki Takahashi in 9:35 with a knee-lock submission, and Takafumi Ito over Takaku Fuke by decision, after going 13 minutes, so Yokohama won overall. In the final match, Masakatsu Funaki of Tokyo used a shoulder lock to beat Katsumi Inagaki in 2:36. Pancrase's late April show will be its first pay-per-view show in Japan, with Funaki defending the title in the main event. WCW has written a letter threatening legal action against Weekly Pro Wrestling magazine for unauthorized use of the NWO mark. Apparently the deal is that word got to Sonny Wanu that the magazine had put out an NWO calendar, an NWO book, and NWO trading cards. Actually, they had as an insert in a magazine done a calendar with photos of the various wrestlers from NWO Japan, and it used the NWO logo, although that logo is used regularly in the magazine to begin with. The NWO book was actually a book recently released on Chono, but it did have the NWO insignia on the cover, since that's what Chono is part of, and the back of the book did have cut-out trading cards of the NWO members from Japan with the insignia. Among the torch carriers of the Olympic flame were not only Great Sasuke, but also Francisco Filio and Jumbo Tsuruta. On the next FMW tour, they will be having a tournament to determine the number 1 contender for Mr. Ganasuk's World Brass Knucks and Independent World Heavyweight titles, with the tourney winner headlining the April 30th show at Yokohama Bunka Gym. Reggie Bennett has returned to Japan along with protege Jessica Soto, who will wrestle in Japan as her cousin Jessie Bennett for Urgin. Urgin's debut show is February 18th, which is a pay-per-view for DirecTV in Japan. The basic technology situation in Japan right now is that due to zoning laws and such, cable TV as it is in the US is never going to proliferate as it does here. However, the expanded satellite dishes will within a few years be in Japan what cable is in the US, or at least something approximating that. Right now there are 3 major dish companies: Perfect TV, the largest, which is in 500,000 homes, DirecTV, which is new starting in December and in very few homes, and a third called JSkyB, which starts in April and will be affiliated with Perfect TV. DirecTV and Perfect TV will run their own PPVs including pro wrestling, but you can't get the other company's shows on a dish from one company. Pancrase is on Perfect TV while Urgin is on DirecTV, which has virtually no universe. At this point there isn't much in the way of money to be made from these shows, but the satellite companies are financing them as an incentive to pick up new subscribers. There was an awards show similar to the MTV Music Awards in the US where the public voted on various cable shows. The October 9th Michinoku Pro Show at Sumo Hall, which aired live on satellite, was voted the best satellite television show, not just pro wrestling but of any show at all, by Dish owners, which shows where wrestling stands in this new technology. The Pride 1 show, which was on pay-per-view, received an honorable mention and a lot of historical mentions as being the first pay-per-view show ever in Japan. Rings has a minor show on March 3rd, probably at Korakuen Hall, and a bigger show on March 28th at Tokyo Bay NK Hall. Here and there. Another of this could only happen in pro wrestling stories. According to local police reports, William Tiny Kinney, a 400-pound pro wrestler out of Summit Hill, Pennsylvania, went on a rampage while naked, smashing his way into a neighbor's house and shouting as he left, and began wandering the street and become combative with police as they tried to take him away in a patrol car. Kinney, who was naked and bleeding from the arms and legs as he was talking down the street when the police found him, first went to a hospital to treat his injuries and was then transferred to a mental hospital. He was yelling stuff about Gatorade, how he wanted to live forever, and then saying he wanted to die, said Police Chief Bruce Markovich. A Memphis bankruptcy judge has ordered Mark and Eugene Selker to amend their complaint by March 2nd and show more evidence, or their lawsuit for fraud in bankruptcy court against Jerry Lawler will be thrown out. Music City ran its fabulous February reunion show on February 7th at the fairgrounds before 800 fans. It was said to have been a really bad show, but the crowd was very hot. Rock and Roll Express beat MCW tag champs the Tennessee Volunteers, Stephen Dunn and Reno Riggins, via DQ on top. The Headbangers no-showed, with it announced that they were injured the previous night in St. Louis, and they were replaced by a team called the Moondogs, one of whom was Bill Smithson, who worked as Moondog Spike in USWA, who teamed with Colorado Kid to go to a double countout with Flash Flanagan and Brickhouse Brown and Terry Golden in a match that went just 3 minutes. Wolfie D went to a double countout with King Mabel, replacing no-show Buddy Landell, in 3:30. Next show is February 14th with no referee, 4 poles and 4 chairs with Doug Gilbert and Wolfie D versus Volunteers, Colorado Kid versus Brown and Tommy Rich versus Mabel. A group called Championship Wrestling on February 7th in Zanesville, Ohio drew 1,400 fans for a show that included the Bushwhackers, Head Shrinkers, Jimmy Snuka, Nasty Boy Brian Knobs, Greg Valentine, and Sherry Martel. Dennis Coraluzzo has added some bouts to his Eddie Gilbert tribute weekend on February 27th and February 28th at the Philadelphia Airport Radisson. Doug and Tommy Gilbert wrestled Dory Funk and Buddy Landell along with Marlena versus Sonny in an arm wrestling contest with Nick Bockwinkel as referee. Franz Schumann from Austria will wrestle while Jim Cornette will work as a manager of the tag team of Ace Darling and Devon Storm. The main event is Sid Vicious versus King Kong Bundy. And the most ridiculous grandstand challenge of all, Cornette has challenged Paul Heyman to a fight, claiming if Heyman shows up and beats him that he'll kiss his feet. Jersey All Pro Wrestling is holding an anniversary show and convention at the Sheraton Hotel in Newark, New Jersey, billing Steve Austin, Shane Douglas, Al Snow, Tommy Dreamer, and more as attending. The flyer we were given doesn't list a date, unfortunately. Green Mountain Wrestling on May 3rd at Fenton Chester Arena in Linden Center, Vermont. Jesse Ventura is looking at running for governor of Minnesota in 1998 on the Reform Party ticket. Ventura is now working as a talk show host on Can AM in Minneapolis. The Cookeville, Tennessee Herald-Citizen had an interview with former pro wrestler and announcer Stan Lane, who is currently working for ESPN2 as a sportscaster for the show Speed World, which covers offshore powerboat racing. Lane said that he had no plans at all about coming back to wrestling, although he gets calls all the time about doing it. He said he worked 2 shows as a favor to Jerry Jarrett, who he called a good friend. He said nobody has called him about working the NWA gimmick for Jim Cornette, saying that he left the WWF on bad terms with Vince McMahon and he thought McMahon would override any decision by Cornette to use him anyway. He criticized the WWF in the article for the current product, saying he didn't think it was a good product now for kids to watch and that if they want to market wrestling in this manner they should stick to airing it late nights, and later said that he would never wrestle again. A correction: when writing about the Luthez Baron Leone match in 1952, it was not at Hollywood Legion Stadium but actually at Gilmore Field. NHB. In an attempt to reverse the political fortunes of the UFC, Semaphore Entertainment Group CEO Bob Marowitz called Mark Ratner of the Nevada State Athletic Commission on February 6 to set up a meeting to where the two sides could work out a rules compromise. Since Nevada, New York, and New Jersey are considered the most influential commissions, a favorable ruling in Nevada, besides allowing the event to take place in Las Vegas, would carry weight in a lot of other states. But as mentioned, there are major political hurdles UFC has to overcome due to senators in both Nevada and Arizona being strongly against UFC as an issue. It is expected Merowitz will make a presentation before the commission in April to seek approval. According to Mark Ratner of the commission, the biggest rules hold up to UFC had been the lack of gloves, lack of rounds, and matches in an octagonal cage as opposed to a square boxing ring. UFC now has gloves and there are many within UFC seriously discussing going to rounds. Booker John Paredes EFC fought its last few shows using rounds and many Vale Tudo events in Japan and even Brazil fight with rounds, instead of a long regulation and shorter overtime periods. Having seen numerous Vale Tudo events both held in cages and in boxing rings, I can state that the cages make for not only more entertaining fights, but are also safer for the participants because it eliminates guys getting tangled up and falling out of the ring, which actually happens with some frequency in Vale Tudo matches in rings, particularly in Brazil. That can be remedied somewhat by putting netting between the bottom rope and the mat so they don't roll together and crash on the floor, but on occasion people have still tumbled over the top rope as in pro wrestling, and unlike in pro wrestling where it's a choreographed spot, in the heat of battle taking that kind of a bump with individuals not trained in those kind of falls can be very dangerous. The cage also eliminates guys rolling under the bottom rope and using the rope to protect themselves on the bottom from strikes, Fabio Gurgel versus Mark Kerr in Brazil. But the cage gives UFC its barbaric feel to those who don't understand it, just as the lack of gloves, which actually made the fights safer and less bloody, did. Some Brazilian shows and most of the Vale Tudo and Shudo matches in Japan have rounds, with varying length, ranging from 5 to 10 minutes, and it has its advantages in that it makes for more stand-ups after some ground stalemates, and it eliminates controversy on the referee when it comes to ordering or not ordering stand-ups and any inconsistencies in those rulings. K1 has also expressed interest in coming to Las Vegas as one of the major hotels is interested in promoting a show. At this point it hasn't been approved, although its rules don't appear to be such that it wouldn't be. Wonder how a commission would view the sometimes suspicious-looking finishes, though. There were two major events over the past 10 days in Brazil. Frederico Lapenda's World Vale Tudo Championships were held on February 1st in Recife, Brazil, with Igor Vovchanchyn, a Russian kickboxer, setting what must have been a record for the quickest win in a match fight as he knocked out American wrestler Nick Nutter in just 9 seconds in the final. As Nutter came charging across for a takedown, Vovchanchyn hit the home run blow of the knee to the head and knocked him cold. This is the one finish when timed right that a skilled striker can nail fast on a grappler, and 2 Pancrase matches on January 16th, Minoru Suzuki's loss to Semischult and Jason Godzi's loss to Ryushi Yanagisawa, were under similar circumstances. By winning the tournament, it increases Vovchanchyn's record to 22-1, the most impressive of anyone in NHB, including winning several tournaments not only in Russia but now also Brazil and Israel. We don't know much else about that show other than Paul Verlins was involved and was beaten and bloodied up by Nutter in the semi-final. On February 8 in Sao Paulo, Brazil, Sergio Battarelli put on his 4th International Vale Tudo tournament with Mike Van Arsdale, the 1997 Wrestling Freestyle World Cup champion, making his NHB debut, winning the 8-man tournament, beating Brazilian Dario Amorim in 2:42 by suplexing him on his shoulder and Amorim being unable to continue. Jason Godzi of Pancrase, coming just 3 weeks after his knockout, lost to Amorim in the first round in 3:01 when he tapped out from punches. Godzi had the early edge, and at one point when they were near the ropes and it was stopped, thought it was being stopped as he was the winner, only to learn it was a restart, and he momentarily lost his focus and wound up being pounded on his back. There were a few interesting notes underneath. In Van Arsdale's first tournament match, he made Francisco Nonito submit in 5:42 with a key lock on the arm, which is a rare occasion of seeing an American amateur wrestler getting a submission from a Brazilian jiu-jitsu stylist. In a first-round match, Tim Catalfo of Atlanta fought Alexander Ferreira and was dominating him when Ferreira twice gouged Catalfo's eyes and was disqualified, and Catalfo had trouble seeing and couldn't continue in the tournament. His vision was said to have started improving over the next day, but he was still going to have to be checked out when he returned home. Amorim at his semifinal won a 30 minutes decision over Bob Gilstrap, a Maurice Smith student from Seattle, in what was said to have been a great match. That gave Van Arsdale quite an advantage for the final, since his semifinal win was against an alternate, since Catalfo couldn't go on, fighter that only went 3:36. Before that show at the rules meeting, Battarelli stated that Cal Worsham would never be invited back to IVC. Battarelli hinted that Worsham, who was under the same manager, Robert DePersia, as Gary Goodridge, basically put Goodridge over in a tournament last year to give Goodridge an easier second-round match in an 8-man tournament that Goodridge ended up winning. Very similar, including the same manager and same eventual tournament winner, Two accusations surrounding the UFC Don Fry/Mark Hall match at the 1996 Ultimate. Pedro Rizzo, who is a Marco Ruas trainee and won a Brazilian NHB tournament recently, has signed with K1 to start on April 9. Not a lot new regarding the next UFC show. Nothing has been officially signed, although there are also no changes from the proposed matches we've been listing. There will be a heavyweight match most likely involving two of these three fighters, Tsuyoshi Kosaka from Rings, Hugo Duarte from Brazil and Chemo. There's virtually no chance that Nobuhiko Takada will be in UFC in May in Japan after all, and it's still not a lock the May UFC will be in Japan in the first place. Apparently his contract for the Gracie fight with KRS stipulates he can't appear as a participant for any other promotion until the fight in October. As mentioned before, there is still an outstanding huge money contract between UFC Japan and Ken Shamrock and the World Wrestling Federation, but whether it'll be honored when there is a Japan show in May isn't clear either. There has been a lot of talk that the May main event would be Randy Couture defending his title against Mark Coleman. Current working brackets for the lightweight tourney in the next UFC is Mike Burnett vs. Eugenio Tato and Townsend Saunders vs. Pat Miletic. Some UFC and NHB fighters have been around elsewhere over the past few weeks. Brad Kohler, a 1996 Olympic trials place winner in Greco-Roman wrestling, had what may have been his first pro wrestling match for Eddie Sharkey's Pro Wrestling America on February 6 in Crystal, Minnesota, winning with an armbar tap-out finish. Becky Levi, who has done a few NHB matches in the US and Japan, and also worked USWF, competed in the World Tough Woman Amateur Division, which aired on pay-per-view from Saginaw, Michigan on February 7, knockout out her first three opponents before being knocked out in the second round of the championship match by Tiffany Logan. Dan Severn was her cornerman in the tournament. Former Pancrase and NHB Lions Den competitor Vernon White lost by armbar in a match in Stockton to Gilbert Castillo, a student of Cesar Gracie. Severn has talked of doing a grappling tournament in Abu Dhabi from March 20 to March 23. Oleg Toktarov is said to be in the same tournament. Severn also signed for a match on April 4 in Guam. ECW. This past weekend was a Florida tour with sold-out shows on February 6 in Fort Lauderdale, 2,000, and February 7 in Kissimmee, Florida, near Orlando, 1,400. The second show was said to have been really hot, particularly a Rob Van Dam vs. Bam Bam Bigelow match, which ended with Van Dam winning due to interference by Sabu, while the first was said to have been okay. The only major angle was a deal where Tommy Dreamer chased Justin Credible out of the building and he jumped in his car, and Dreamer jumped on the car as he drove off. Credible is supposed to wrestle Great Sasuke on the May 3 pay-per-view. Credible vs. Dreamer in a first blood match was announced for the February 21 ECW Arena show along with Taz vs. Brackus, which looks to be a one-note song since I believe it's Brackus' final appearance at the arena before going back to WWF. Taz vs. Bigelow, which is the pay-per-view main event, was tested out in Fort Lauderdale with a DQ finish. As it turns out, Sabu is nothing short of a medical visionary. Doctors working for Closure Medical Corporation testified before the FDA this past week to approve of Dermabond, a modified version of super glue, as a new method to close wounds instead of using scar-prone stitches or staples. According to the testimony, it takes far less time to apply than it takes to stitch up a wound, doesn't require a repeat visit to remove the stitches, and it doesn't hurt at all. Sabu has been using super glue to close wounds over the past few years, and he was considered something of a laughingstock when he started doing it. WCW. Nitro on February 9 from El Paso, Texas drew a sellout 9,085 fans, 8,646 paying $168,940 plus $99,635 in merchandise. As mentioned earlier, it was a very good show in front of a super hot crowd. In the dark match, Chavo Guerrero Sr., who is the same age as Ric Flair, pinned David Taylor. Guerrero got a huge reaction since he's originally from El Paso and I believe still lives there, but apparently he looked bad, missing a lot of moves including his moonsault block finisher. The show opened with a Hulk Hogan/Eric Bischoff interview where Hogan talked about him being number one in the pecking order and challenged Randy Savage, who accepted the challenge for later in the show. Steve McMichael pinned Glacier in 4:08 with a tombstone piledriver. After the match, Mortis attacked McMichael, but he gave him a tombstone as well and decked James Vandenberg to boot. Match was real bad, but it was actually very entertaining because of Louis Spicolli doing color in place of Larry Zbyszko. They did several segments with Spicolli, as they ran an angle where Spicoli stole Zbyszko's luggage and somehow the NWO got Zbyszko's driver to take him to a different building, and he showed up late. Spicoli was hilarious doing color. Conan beat Norman Smiley in 438 with the Tequila Sunrise. If you're wondering why Smiley's trunks read magic on it, it's because he's magician in real life. No, actually because his wrestling name for most of his career has been Black Magic. They aired a tape of their motorsports BS that the crowd live booed the hell out of. Nick Patrick did an interview saying he was going to ref, but J.J. Dillon came out and said he was still suspended. Patrick does a great job on the mic. Dillon had security take him away. They are apparently working on a gimmick to reinstate Patrick so he ends up being the ref of the Hogan-Sting match. Disco Inferno pinned Yuji Nagata in 258 with the Chartbuster. Disco's finishing hold is the most over move in the entire business. After the match, La Parka came out and hit both Disco and Nagata with a chair and danced around getting a big pop. With the exception of Dandy, all of the Azteca wrestlers got huge reactions since Juarez, which is across the border from El Paso, has always been a hotbed for wrestling. Eddie Guerrero and Chris Jericho beat Dean Malenko and Chavo Jr. in 902 when Jericho made Chavo submit to the crab. Excellent match. The crowd live was really into Eddie and Chavo Jr. since both are from El Paso. They didn't react to Jericho versus Malenko, even thought the action was good with them involved as well. Juventud Guerrera, also getting a big reaction, pinned Dandy with a Firebird Splash in 340. After the match, Jericho attacked Guerrera, leading to Guerrera issuing a challenge for a mask versus title match at the Cow Palace. WCW wants the masks off most of the Mexicans, and there are some that it's okay and some where it's a mistake. They can't do it with Parka, although nobody has suggested it either, and shouldn't with Psicosis, although that has been suggested, and it is a risk with Mysterio Jr., but Guerrero would be okay, although it's way too soon to do it if it's at the Cow Palace. Bill Goldberg pinned Steven Regal with a jackhammer in 501. Simply put, it doesn't matter the opponent, Goldberg's matches have to be 90 seconds. He was totally exposed here and everyone in the crowd was it before their eyes. There was some heat on Regal because they thought he was kind of exposing him since Regal is a legitimate shooter as opposed to a paper shooter, but Regal was just doing a wrestling match and Goldberg only has his 3 spots and his quick burst of intensity and is lost doing anything else. Chris Adams beat Spicoli via DQ in 156 using Zbyszko's briefcase, and after the match Zbyszko showed up and chased Spicoli around. That run down the aisle was the most movement Zbyszko has ever shown in his entire wrestling career. Perry Saturn pinned Ultimo Dragon in 708 with a small package reversing a Dragon suplex. Dragon was great and Saturn worked hard, although he really doesn't get much heat. Solid match. Booker T was supposed to wrestle Raven, but the entire flock destroyed Booker T, ending with Raven putting the DDT on him and Saturn using the rings of Saturn on him. Savage beat Hogan via DQ in 748 when Savage dropped the elbow on him and the entire NWO did a run-in. Savage did a great job in this match, including take a bump mouth first off the top rope onto the guardrail. While there are a lot of younger, hungrier wrestlers who would do that, how many guys of Savage's age and with his bank account are still taking chances like that? Hogan is terrible athletically, but at least he was trying and he took 2 fairly decent chair shots before the finish. After the match, the NWO held Savage and Hogan hit him twice with a chair. As the NWO was leaving, Savage ran out of the ring and jumped on them again. Match was decent and that's all you can hope for with Hogan, but the segment overall was good. Luger then came out and challenged Savage, who jumped him from behind. Sting then came out and attacked Savage, giving him the Scorpion Death Drop. At this point the NWO came out, but a net dropped from the ceiling on Luger, Sting and Savage, and the NWO destroyed them, injuring Sting. Finally Steiners beat Hall and Nash for the tag titles in 7-11. Better match than you'd figure since it was mainly Hall versus Scott. Again Scott wouldn't tag, but Hall basically knocked Scott into Rick, which constituted a tag. As Hall was about to deliver the edge, Rick, the legal man, came off the top with a bulldog on Hall for the pin. Scott at first wasn't happy about winning the title since he didn't get the pin, but at the end did hug Rick and everything. Latest on Flair Watch. Flair was supposed to appear on the February 5th Thunder from Beaumont, Texas in a singles match against Eddie Guerrero. Don't know what the situation was and where signals were crossed, but this time Flair wasn't at the building. Flair did wrestle at the weekend house shows in Texas. At one point the plan was to shoot an angle in El Paso which apparently was to lead to Flair and Bret Hart as a tag team against Hall and Nash, but Flair was booked on February 10th and February 11th in New York as part of the Toy Fair representing WCW, so one hand didn't know what the other hand in the company was doing. Flair has basically agreed to a 3-year deal with WCW but hasn't actually signed the piece of paper. As best we can tell, that angle is going to be shot soon, but no word on when soon is. Rumors that he might be leaving naturally started since he's disappeared from television for a few weeks, but that's premature. WWF took advantage of those rumors for its 900 line, talking about a former NWA champion looking to join the NWA, since rumors came up with the very logical idea that the one thing that would put the NWA group into prominence and give it credibility in the WWF was if Flair was the top star in that group. But the name WWF talked about if you called the 900 line was Dory Funk, who is currently under contract with WWF to work as a trainer and a coach. Kevin Green was cut by the San Francisco 49ers as a concession to the salary cap on February 9th, so it wouldn't surprise anyone to see him back here. His 49er contract didn't allow him to do any pro wrestling. Pete Lothario worked under the name Jose Lothario Jr. and losing a tryout match at the February 2nd Nitro tapings in San Antonio. Thunder on February 5th in Beaumont, Texas drew a sellout 4,897, 4,633 paying $90,180. The show did a 3.8 rating and 5.6 share live and 0.9 rating and 3.9 share for the replay. The number was very strong since it went against the Nancy vs. Tanya interview on Fox, 9.8, which was about as anticlimactic as Hogan vs. Sting at Starrcade, and Harding came off as almost a sick pathological liar, and the Duke, North Carolina basketball game on ESPN2, 2.9. Dated reference of the week was Lee Marshall, in talking about the problems with the Steiners, said their relationship wasn't like Wally and the Beef, which is an early 60s reference, but that show is kind of timeless, so it's okay, or the Smothers Brothers, which was a very popular comedy act in the 60s who aren't timeless, so the reference is really outdated. Hugh Morris pinned La Parka with a moonsault in 2:46. After the match, Parka clocked him with a chair. To answer the most obvious question, Morris wasn't really thrilled about putting Conan over the previous Monday in his first match back after being off TV for a while, so in the interest of diplomacy they gave him a win over Parka, once again stalling the planned major push for Parka. Goldberg destroyed Jim Powers in 1:08. Billy Kidman pinned Guerrero in 4:48 with the shooting star press due to lots of interference. Given that Guerrero was in line for a big pay-per-view match, this doesn't make any sense at all either, except when you figure Raven tied to Page, who is tied to Bischoff, so his flock has the political connections. This was the best match on the show. At one point, Guerrero did a flying Frankensteiner coming off the top rope onto Kidman on the apron, flipping Kidman into Saturn on the floor. He bruised his knee on the move and will be replacing his regular wrestling knee pads with the skating knee pads that a lot of the flying wrestlers are turning to because the plastic gives more protection to the knee. Silver King and Villanos 4 and 5 beat Lismark Jr. and Super Calo and Chavo Jr. in 4:30 when King pinned Chavo after Psicosis interfered, coming off the top with the Norte California Jam onto him. Lismark did an awesome dive. Good match, but not a great match. Silver King is the most underrated worker in the Big Two promotions. Steiners beat Bagwell and Conan via DQ in 3:37 when Hall pushed Rick off the top rope for the DQ, but he crashed into Scott and the two argued after the match. Raven pinned Marty Jannetty in 5:41 with a DDT after a bulldog on a chair. Good TV bout. Saturn beat Disco in 10:06 with the rings. This was a weird match. It was really sloppy and bad early with no heat. It picked up with a lot of good near falls, and then the finish looked totally stupid. Disco was out with his face to the mat. Saturn was out, but standing held up by the ropes. Saturn was pushed off the ropes and he fell onto Disco, and even though Disco's stomach was on the mat, ref Charles Robinson, thinking it was the finish, began counting the fall, then stopped. Both guys had one of those deals where time stands still and nothing happens before Saturn put on the rings. After the match, team made the save. Jim Neidhart beat Spicoli via DQ in 55 seconds when Hall interfered. Bulldog made the save and power slammed Spicoli and had a hard time doing it, but then McMichael attacked Bulldog. Finally, Diamond Dallas Page kept the U.S. title going to a no contest with Chris Benoit in 6 minutes. Match was a disappointment and Page's stock fell with a lot of people since Benoit can have a good match with almost anyone. Page had Benoit beat when Raven ran in and DDT'd Benoit. Page then gave everyone in the flock except Raven the Diamond Cutter saving Benoit. This sets up a Page vs. Benoit title rematch at the pay-per-view, which eventually leads to Raven and Saturn vs. Page and Benoit tag matches. Have you ever noticed that everyone who is pulled trying to climb the ladder always wants to do their program with Benoit, but when they're on top of the ladder, nobody wants to? Johnny Grunge is back wrestling after the kidney injury suffered at the last Orlando tapings. Cow Palace is sold out for the pay-per-view with about 12,000 tickets sold for $297,000. Lots of advanced sellouts on the schedule, including Terre Haute and Kansas City. while Winston-Salem for Nitro on March 9th was at $7,891 for $191,165. The planned pay-per-view on May 17th in Toronto has been moved to Worcester, Massachusetts. There were several reasons for the move, the main one being they wanted to go with Hogan vs. Hart for the title, but Bischoff felt he wanted to save it for later in the year and build it up long and slow, learning for the lesson of the Hogan-Sting buy rate. There are also all kinds of minor problems resulting from doing a pay-per-view in Canada, and they wanted to postpone it until later in the year. Major shows in May will be May 4th Nitro in Indianapolis, No Thunder the week of May 7th, Nitro on May 11th in Kansas City at Kemper Arena, Thunder on May 14th in Durham, New Hampshire, pay-per-view in Worcester on May 17th at the Centrum, Nitro on May 18th at the Providence, Rhode Island Civic Center. Thunder on May 21st in Cleveland at Cleveland State University, May 25th Nitro in Evansville, Indiana at Roberts Stadium, and May 27th Thunder in Nashville. WCW Saturday Night on January 31st drew a 2.7 rating and February 7th drew a 2.9 rating. Nitro and Raw are both going head-to-head now in the United Kingdom. Nitro had been edited down to 1 hour, but is being expanded starting in March to a 2.5-hour show, while Raw airs in a 2-hour format. Lineups for both March 25th in Baltimore and March 28th in Auburn Hills, Michigan are Hogan vs. Sting, Cage for the title, Hart vs. Hall, Flair vs. Kurt Hennig, Page and Benoit vs. Raven and Saturn, McMichael vs. Bulldog, Steve vs. Rick Martel, Goldberg vs. Jerry Flynn, and a Lucha Libre tag match. March 29th in Milwaukee is the same exact lineup except Savage headlines in place of Hogan against Sting. Pittsburgh on March 6th has Luger vs. Nash, Rick Steiner vs. Bagwell, Benoit vs. Raven, and McMichael vs. Goldberg. House shows for the week saw February 3rd in Corpus Christi, Texas drew a sellout 3,106, paying $49,549 for the Saturday night taping. February 6th in Huntsville, Texas drew 3,262, paying $59,172. February 7th in Abilene, Texas drew 6,791, paying $129,538, and February 8th in Midland, Texas drew a sellout 5,316, paying $87,777. Merchandise for the week set new records, particularly in Corpus Christi, where they came close to what would be a record in that they did almost as much in merchandise as on the house itself, doing $44,759, which would be, to the best of our knowledge, an all-time record for American pro wrestling of $14.41 per head. For the week, WCW set what I'd believe to be a company record for a one-week house show run, doing $332,299 in merchandise, which is $10.46 per head over the course of a full week. About the only thing noteworthy at the Saturday night tapings were that the Steiners were wearing the WCW tag titles on February 3rd, which basically said that they would have to be winning them within the next 12 days. Hector Garza should be back in 2 weeks. For the week from January 26th to February 1st, the top 5 rated shows on basic cable were the 5 hours of Nitro and Thunder for the week, since they break up the show into separate 1-hour shows, unlike movies and sports where the entire show is figured together as one show. Actually, an HBO movie called Gia had a higher rating, but that's pay cable as opposed to basic cable. WWF. Raw was taped on February 3rd in Evansville, Indiana before a sellout 8,457, paying $112,906. The show opened with Sunny dressed as Marilyn Monroe, singing Happy Birthday to Fred Blassie, who turned 80 this past weekend. Steve Austin opened doing an interview with DX on the screen, showing that he had stolen the WWF title belt, and they built the entire show up for an eventual confrontation as the show ended. Jeff Jarrett and Barry Windham beat LOD via DQ when Blackjack Bradshaw interfered, as Jarrett had the figure 4 on Animal in 5:06. The LOD was a little peeved at Bradshaw's interference. There were strong hints that WWF is going to repackage LOD. Fast-paced good match. Really. Henry Godwin beat Pierre in 4:38 when first Jock interfered and then Phineas interfered, each doing a bucket shot. Brian Christopher and Pantera beat Taka Michinoku and Aguila in 8:31 when Christopher gave Pantera a foreign object to load his mask and he came off the top with a headbutt on Taka for the pin. Best match on the show. I'll bet that was a Pat Patterson idea, since he spent years doing that finish. Aguila did a rolling corkscrew tope that was outrageous. He still has a way to go. He's actually 20, not 19 like they said on TV, but he just had his birthday about 6 weeks back, but the guy has potential. Kane and Paul Bearer did an interview, saying Undertaker would never be back, which pretty much guarantees he'll be back in about a week. In reality, Undertaker was given the time off both to heal up from all his injuries and also to spend time with his father who was in poor health. Rocky Maivia and Farouk beat Ken Shamrock and Chains in 4:22 when Rocky hit Shamrock hard right in the face with a chair and Farouk got the pin. Good match. After the match, Shamrock acted like a wounded animal and began suplexing everyone in sight, including Chains, before the DOA and Ahmed Johnson calmed him down. Don't know if Shamrock is really the world's most dangerous man, but he sure is to referees. Steve Blackman beat Recon in 4:35. Both guys looked really green. Jackal came down from the ceiling preaching with a pulpit. Delivery was good. It took all the attention away from the match, but it was just as well. After the match, Jackal was yelling at Recon that if he didn't follow orders he'd be back in Memphis making $40 per night and eating tuna out of a can, and slapped his face. Recon acted like he wanted to hit him back but didn't. Outlaws then reenacted the dumpster angle with crash dummies dressed up as Cactus and Chainsaw. Boricuas were looking for Austin after making a deal with China, but he locked them up in a room. Thrasher beat Goldust in 4:28 when the person CBS called world's most dangerous boob job. Sable slapped Goldust. Sable and Luna were arguing, you can only imagine over what, with Sable slapping Luna before she stormed off, probably to get another breast enlargement. I think it's something like the old nuclear arms race where we all have enough bombs to blow up the world 15 times. But we still keep building more bombs. Show ended with DX coming out for an interview and Austin following. Outlaws came out as well. At this point, Chainsaw cut a hole in the ring and he and Cactus came from underneath. Owen Hart showed up as well. While this was all going on, China managed to steal back the WWF title belt. A few decent matches, but overall a flat show. Well, maybe flat isn't the right word to use with Implant Mania running wild. It seems stupid with all these references, like in the days when Jim Ross would spend too much time focusing on boob jokes at Missy Hyatt, but things really have gotten preposterous. Bobby Duncombe Jr., Johnny Ace, One Men Gang and Mr. Can't Call Him Flash Flanagan were all given tryouts on February 2nd in Indianapolis. None looked particularly good. Duncombe showed potential since he is a good athlete but didn't have a good match trying to wrestle like Stan Hansen losing to D'Lo Brown. Ace was put over Flash Funk and Gang, who didn't show much, put over Thrasher but later beat Flanagan. Because of Ace's commitments with All Japan, the only way he could be used is to be pushed as a superstar in part-time as a major short-term angle or just used in prelims to fill out a card, and on his own he wasn't impressive enough. Although Kenta Kobashi himself talked about coming to WWF in the summer, at this point there has not even been the beginnings of any discussion of that happening. Vader will be having eye surgery after the Houston pay-per-view and is expected to be out of action around 6 weeks. That makes it touch and go whether he'll be back for Mania, so he probably won't have a prominent role in the show or one at all because he isn't certain to be back in time. The Houston pay-per-view was a sellout about 1 week in advance with 13,356 tickets sold for $226,242. House shows for the week besides Evansville were February 4th in Cape Girardeau, Missouri, drawing 5,281, paying $90,984. February 5th in Springfield, Illinois, drawing 4,052, paying $73,986, and February 6th in St. Louis with 18,877, paying $275,289. We don't have complete merchandise figures for the week, but the average was about $7.66 per head. Most of the March Arena lineups are similar. March 6th in Montreal is Austin vs. Helmsley, Hart vs. Goldust, Charlie and Cactus vs. Outlaws, Maivia vs. Shamrock, Bradshaw vs. Wyndham, Elodie vs. Godwins, Quebecers vs. Savio and Miguel, Kane vs. Chains, Mero vs. Brandy, and Taka vs. Christopher. March 7th in Detroit is the same, while March 8th in Buffalo is similar except the main is a 6-man with Austin and Charlie and Cactus vs. Helmsley and Outlaws, with minor underneath alterations and with 6-mans in B cities, San Diego, Salt Lake City, etc., and Austin vs. Helmsley a single and a tag title match in a cities, Anaheim, Madison Square Garden. The shows are basically the same the rest of the month. As you can see, Funk is working a full schedule. Hints being dropped of Marlena to be brought back soon to feud with Goldust and Luna. Correction and a spelling error from last week. Bradshaw's real name is John Leafield, not Hayfield. Weekend ratings saw for the weekend of January 31st through February 1st saw Livewire at 1.4 and Superstars at 2.0, and for February 7th through February 8th Livewire did a 1.6 and Superstars at 2.1. The July pay-per-view is tentatively scheduled for July 26th in Fresno. Dan Severn should be debuting within the next few weeks. The readers' pages. Double cross. As usual, the awards issue was great. I probably wouldn't disagree with any of the winners except one. What were people smoking when they voted Diamond Dallas Page's Diamond Cutter as the best move? Out of all the unbelievable high-flying moves we see on a consistent basis, it boggles me to see that move win. That's the type of move that belongs in the eras of the superplexes and superfly leaps winning. Maybe it's the best move because after the move is performed, Kimberly jumps up and down. I haven't commented on it before as a lot of people have, but I think Vince McMahon was way off base in his attempt to justify the Bret Hart screw job. The one thing that got to me in McMahon's comments was him stating that people don't follow specific wrestlers, they cheer for the organization. Wrong. I'm not a supporter of a federation, I follow the wrestlers, and it happens that a lot of the wrestlers I follow are in WCW. One of the few reasons I even turned to the WWF was to see Bret, Owen, and Bulldog. All people at work that follow wrestling talk about is what is happening with Bret Hart and Ric Flair. The chemistry